Roger Keith Barrett, more commonly known by his nickname Syd Barrett, was the original lead singer, guitarist, and the first major creative force behind the iconic classic rock band Pink Floyd. In 1964, he joined a band called the T-Set, which after several lineup and name changes eventually became Pink Floyd in late 1965. Although they originally played mostly rhythm and blues, they quickly developed their own unique psychedelic sound. After signing with EMI in 1967, they recorded and released their debut album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Featuring weird psychedelic sounds, heavy guitar riffs, and Syd Barrett's eccentric sound and whimsical nursery rhyme-like lyrics, this album was unlike anything the world had ever heard. Though the rest of the band had contributed significantly to the album, it is without a doubt completely the result of Syd Barrett's unparalleled genius. However, not long after its release, Barrett began to exhibit increasingly erratic behavior. He would often stop playing in the middle of concerts, or just start playing a completely different song than the one the band was playing at the time. Though there is much debate on what caused his decline in mental health, it is general consensus that it had a lot to do with his excessive drug use, although it is also theorized that he had a mild case of schizophrenia as well. Nevertheless, it soon got to a point where it was impossible for them to do any live performances with Syd. Because of this, for their second album, A Saucerful of Secrets, the band decided to stop performing with Syd, but let him continue to write and record music with the band. For touring purposes, they replaced Syd with guitarist David Gilmour, who would fill in for Syd during live performances. However, before the completion of the album, Syd was in such a terrible state that this arrangement was also nearly impossible. So, by early 1968, Syd Barrett was ousted from the band. After only a few years of work, Syd Barrett was no longer in the band that he had been the mastermind of just a mere year earlier. Though he would go on to release 2 solo albums in 1970, Syd mostly retired from the music business at that point. That was it for Syd. No more See Emily Play, no more Bike, no more Interstellar Overdrive. Syd would live alone for the rest of his life, and as for Pink Floyd, well, the rest is history. In the wake of Barrett's departure, bassist Roger Waters would take control of the band, writing most of the band's material and creating some of their finest work. And guitarist David Gilmour would also play a vital role in creating Waters' genius work. And perhaps that is a good thing. Perhaps if Syd had stayed in the band, Waters' genius may have never been able to shine through. Perhaps if Syd had never left the band, we would have never gotten any of Pink Floyd's beautiful masterpieces like The Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. But perhaps if Syd had been able to overcome his problems and continue to be with the band, he may have gone on to create even better works that are far beyond anything we could ever imagine. The truth is, we can't help but wonder what would have happened if Syd had stayed in the band. In this video, I'm going to be taking an in-depth look at what could have been, so grab some snacks, sit back, and enjoy the ride. So, there are basically 2 ways this could have gone. Either Syd Barrett never had the problems that he did, and was able to continue to tour with and lead the band, or he did struggle with his mental health, but he was able to deal with it enough that he could at least continue to write and record material with the band. I'm going to start by talking about the latter, and I think if we're going to talk about this, it's important to look at the most famous example of this kind of setup working, that being the Beach Boys. In 1964, after heavy touring with the band for 2 years, bassist and lead singer Brian Wilson suffered a mental breakdown caused by intense stress due to the band's constant touring. Because of this, Brian Wilson decided that he did not want to continue to tour with the band. However, due to the fact that he was, at the time, the band's primary songwriter and producer, they decided that he should continue to write and record material with the band. But unlike with Pink Floyd, this actually worked quite well. After he stopped touring and could focus solely on writing songs, Wilson went on to produce some of the Beach Boys' best work, including Pet Sounds, which is widely considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time. However, not long after the release of Pet Sounds, Wilson's mental health began to become far worse. This caused him to begin to contribute less and less to each Beach Boys album, and spend more and more time living as a recluse in his mansion, much like what Syd Barrett did after Pink Floyd. Though Brian's mental health eventually got better, and he was able to record several solo albums and even start touring later in life, the majority of the Beach Boys' post-Pet Sounds material had very few contributions from Brian Wilson. Instead, his brother Carl Wilson took over as leader of the band, and Brian, though still a contributing member, was in no way the band's leader anymore. In my opinion, I think that it's very likely that something like this could have happened with Pink Floyd. By 1968, Sid's condition was clearly getting worse, and even if Sid was able to get help, I find it unlikely that he could have ever gotten into the right mind to continue to be the band's driving force, as he was during the Piper at the Gates of Dawn era. As well, if you know anything about David Gilmour or Roger Waters, you know that they both have gigantic egos. I find it very unlikely that they would have continued to just go along with whatever ideas were being given to them by Sid, a guy who wasn't even helping them with touring. Eventually, Sid would have been squeezed out, and even if he stayed a member of the group, probably wouldn't continue to be the band's mastermind. What does this mean for the music? Well, we very well might have gotten several more Syd Barrett-led albums, all of which would have probably been outstanding works. But eventually, David and Roger would have probably taken control, and then, well, we get albums like what Pink Floyd produced during their classic period. Though I think the music would have been drastically different in this situation, I think that the end result would have been the same. Roger Waters and David Gilmour would have taken control of the band, and their genius would have shined. Now I'm going to talk about what would have happened if Sid had never gone crazy and was able to continue to tour with the band. First of all, David Gilmour would never be in the band. As far as what would have happened to him had he never joined Floyd, I don't quite know. Before he joined Pink Floyd, he was in a band called Joker's Wild, which was doing quite well for a while playing R&B covers, though by the time Gilmour was offered to join Pink Floyd, they had been broken up for quite some time. However, I think he very well might have joined another band and became successful with them, as he was a very talented individual. If there's anything Pink Floyd's post-Waters music has taught us, it's that David Gilmour is very capable of leading a band by himself. So, I have very little doubt that Gilmour could have become successful without joining Floyd. Pink Floyd themselves would have carried on with the same lineup that was featured on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. As Sid is still in perfect health and can continue to tour with and lead the band, their second album would probably have looked a lot different from Saucerful of Secrets. Though Saucerful of Secrets did have some contributions from Sid, the album was mostly done by the rest of the band. This paired with Sid's declining mental health caused Saucerful of Secrets to not have the same whimsical, joyful sound that was found on Piper. In this situation, however, Sid does not have any problems with his mental health, and can continue to contribute and function just as well as he did on Piper. So I believe that their second album would have probably carried on in the direction of Piper at the Gates of Dawn, having Sid's signature whimsical psychedelic pop sound. But would Pink Floyd have ended up evolving their sound past the psychedelic music from Piper? Pink Floyd does certainly have a reputation for evolving their sound a lot, but most of that innovation happened because of Roger Waters and David Gilmour. So with Gilmour out of the picture, and with Roger playing a more minor role in the band, I cannot say with certainty that Pink Floyd would have had the same constant innovation that Waters and Gilmour brought to the band. So, I guess the real question we need to ask ourselves is, would Roger Waters have ended up becoming a major contributor had Sid stayed in the band? Well, we all know that it was Sid's departure that caused Waters to take control of the group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he wouldn't have still been able to play an important role in the group's music if Sid had stayed. For example, the only song on Piper at the Gates of Dawn that wasn't written by Barrett was Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk, which was written entirely by Waters and even featured his lead vocals. Though this is his only big contribution to Piper, he also wrote the song Walk With Me Sydney, which was one of the first songs Pink Floyd ever recorded, while they were still called the T-Set. These two songs and the Rick Wright written B-side Paintbox were the only two songs that Pink Floyd recorded that weren't written by Barrett before 1968. So So of the 3 non-Barrett written songs from this period, 2 of them were written by Waters. Therefore, we can clearly see that Roger was always one of the more productive members of the band, even before Sid's departure. So perhaps he would have still became an important force in the band. I certainly don't see that as unlikely. That being said, I don't think that he would have ended up leading the band like he did in our timeline. Syd Barrett was clearly more than capable of leading the band in their early years, and I think that he probably would have continued to do just as well throughout the band's history. This means that though we would have probably gotten a lot of good Roger Waters written songs, we would have never gotten any of the Waters dominated masterpieces like The Wall, or the criminally underrated Final Cut. But there is very little doubt in my mind that Pink Floyd would have still created amazing music, though I think it would have been a lot different from what we have now. Another thing that we need to talk about is, even if Pink Floyd had continued to create amazing music, would they have had the commercial success that they had in the 70s? At the time of Syd's departure, Pink Floyd were not a hugely popular band. Piper at the Gates of Dawn did very well, and they did have a hit single with See Emily Play, which reached number 6 in the UK charts. But they were by no means the biggest band in the world. It is uncertain whether or not they would have reached the superstar status that they did under Waters' leadership. Music that Syd Barrett made with Pink Floyd was incredibly eccentric and psychedelic, and though that type of music was quite popular at the time, it ended up going out of style in the early 70s in favor of the progressive rock that the Waters-led Pink Floyd specialized in. Would Pink Floyd have ended up evolving into that kind of music had Syd stayed the leader of it? As I said earlier, Pink Floyd has a reputation for constantly evolving their sound, but it was Roger Waters' leadership that earned the band that reputation. Would Syd have brought Pink Floyd into the new era as successfully as Waters did? Well, to be honest, I don't really think so. From what I've seen in interviews, books, and documentaries about Syd didn't really care much about whether or not his music became hugely popular. He was first and foremost an artist, and though this is certainly not a bad thing, I do think that if you mix that with his tendency to create really weird and wild music, you probably get music that isn't going to appeal to the masses in the same way that Roger Waters' music did. So I believe that instead of evolving into a more accessible and commercial band, Pink Floyd probably would have become even weirder and wilder. That's certainly not a bad thing, but that does mean that instead of becoming one of the most well-known bands of the classic rock era, Pink Floyd would have probably become a more underground experimental act. And though I think they would still have a devoted fan base to this day, their popularity would probably be closer to that of the 13th Floor Elevators than that of one of the more mainstream classic rock acts like Led Zeppelin. But in the end, they still would have undoubtedly created amazing music that probably would be loved for centuries to come. But in the end, it doesn't matter what would have happened, because the Pink Floyd that we got is one of the best bands to ever exist. Their psychedelic soundscapes and introspective, philosophical lyrics have influenced countless bands and have earned them a place in history as one of the most successful and influential acts of the classic rock era. Whether they would have been better or worse had Syd stayed, I don't know. But in the end, Pink Floyd will always be an amazing band that will be loved for generations, both in this timeline or in any other hypothetical world that we could dream up.